Eli here again. It occurs to me that anyone following this series will read the title and know it's me, but I still like to write it out. It's nice to remind myself that despite everything that's happened, I'm still me, and that other people out there in the world know that I, Eli, still exist. Well, that started off a little deeper than I meant it to, but I'm not changing it now. Anyway, first things first, to address something you've probably all been wondering and maybe expecting, but which I haven't actually confirmed, I've decided to go to that bookstore and find Zoe. However, I've also decided to be less of an idiot than I was at Christmas, so I'm not going until I'm fully healed. On that note, I'm doing better. It's been about a month since the concert hall monster extravaganza. The slashes across my face and back have closed up, leaving some impressive scars. I would say they ruined my perfect face, but who am I kidding? My face was not perfect before all this. Besides, there's hardly anyone around to see me now anyway, except Mr. Bailey, and he doesn't seem to mind the scars. He loves me for who I am. I don't really know how to tell if you've fully recovered from a concussion, but I can look at a computer screen or read for a while now without my vision blurring or my head feeling like it's going to split open. I'm still getting occasional dizzy spells or headaches, but they're less frequent, so I assume I'm on the mend. And last but not least, my arm. Still in a sling. Hurts less, and I can move my fingers and hand pretty well. I'm gonna give it another week or two, but I think I'm getting close there. I'm hoping to be all charged up and ready to go by the end of the month. In the meantime, I figured I'd tell you about one of those last few monsters I haven't mentioned yet. I'm pretty sure I mentioned these fuckers in my very first story, but I've never elaborated on them. Mostly because, 1, I don't encounter them very much in my day-to-day life because of where they tend to hang out, and 2, they creep me out, man. Seriously, they just disturb me. Oh wait, one side comment before I continue. Someone suggested I try talking to Mr. Bailey. You know, see if he understands me, which he often seems to, or if he can make a system for communicating with me. I tried. I offered a system of 1 meow for yes, 2 meows for no, but he just stared at me the whole time. I swear, the look in his eyes certainly gave off the appearance that he knew what I was saying and that little gears were turning behind his furry forehead. But then he didn't meow, until I gave up and asked him if he wanted dinner, at which point he started purring and came over to rub on my leg. So I don't know. Maybe he only knows keywords like how most pets learn their name or retreat or walk. Maybe he doesn't want to, or can't communicate for some reason. Maybe he's just being a typical asshole cat and will only respond when he feels like it. I guess only time will tell. Until then, at least he cuddles with me and keeps me company just the same. Okay, now on to the monster of the day. Today's feature, Sandra's. You know how I said I don't go to hardware stores because they're popular monster hangouts? Yeah, that's true. And Sandra's are some of the major inhabitants. I think it's because they like places that have a garden section. Soils, plants, shovels, all that type of stuff. I've also seen them in the garden center of Walmart, which is why I avoid the garden center of Walmart. Most common, though, are actual gardens or parks. Anywhere with a lot of plants or dirt, really. That's how I'm able to avoid frequent encounters with them. If I stay in buildings or on streets, I probably won't meet a Sandra. It's similar to Ashley's in places with food, only it's easier to avoid parks and botanical gardens than it is to avoid grocery stores. Since, you know, a guy and his cat have gotta eat. I first saw one from a distance as it was targeting someone else. Yes, this was months ago, when people were only an endangered species and not an almost extinct one. And honestly, thank God it wasn't going after me, because if it had been, I would be dead. Allow me to take you back to that encounter. Picture this. A warm spring day, slight breeze, sun shining through wisps of clouds. It was too nice to stay inside. I mean, even if monsters and rotting corpses were everywhere, I figured I could sneak out and take a cautious stroll to the public park nearby. I'd have weapons and Mr. B, and I hoped that a park wouldn't be the kind of place monsters would swarm to anyway. After all, most of them like cool or dark or cavernous spaces. In other words, everything that a park in springtime isn't. So I took a little walk. And before you call me an idiot for taking a pointless stroll through Monster City, it wasn't just for my pleasure. The park trail was actually a shortcut to the nearest grocery store when I was squatting in that house, not the same one I currently reside in, and I had my empty duffel over my shoulder, going to stock up on food. I simply figured a stroll through the park would be more enjoyable when the weather was so nice than marching through the streets would be, and that I'd be less likely to run into monsters there. Man, irony is a real bitch sometimes. For the first few minutes, the walk was as pleasant as I hoped it would be. Sunbeams through the leaves, a few flowers blooming here and there along the path, Mr. B contently trotting by my side. It was almost enough to forget the hell that surrounded me. And then, it wasn't, because suddenly I heard singing. Which doesn't sound all that bad, right? Wrong. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I knew it couldn't be anything good, because no human trying to survive would burst into song, loud song, in public. So I reacted in the automatic way people react when they hear something they don't want to hear. I immediately stuck my knife through my belt loop and put my hands over my ears. Thank God I did, because in just the few seconds it had taken me to do that, pain was now shooting through my head, and I was pretty sure my ears were bleeding. I could feel something wet on my palms. This is probably a good time to mention the rule I have for Sandra's. Rule number 8. Plug your ears immediately if you hear any singing, preferably with earplugs or something similar. The less you can hear, the safer you are. Don't use your hands, because you'll need them to fight. If you run, you'll be dead. See, the singing was good. By that I mean it actually sounded, nice. Like it was on key and carried a tune well. But it hurt. The second I'd heard it, my head had exploded in pain, like my brain was about to burst, and my ears had throbbed. Now that my ears were covered by my hands, I could still hear the singing, but it was much quieter. Which meant that even though my head was still thrumping in pain and my ears were still leaking blood, I no longer felt like my head was literally about to explode. Like in that first Kingsman movie, remember that? The pressure and pain I felt with the singing at full volume made it feel like I was half a second away from that happening. Ugh. I would have liked to take my hands off my ears to grab my knife again, but as I just described, I was afraid my head would explode if I did, and also I was still in a good bit of pain, so I left them where they were. I didn't have any earplugs on me at the time because I had never encountered a Sandra before. I'm sure I looked like an idiot, but at least my head was intact. Carefully, my grocery trip now forgotten, I dropped low and basically duck-walked in the direction of the singing. Luckily, I wasn't too far from a cluster of tall bushes, so I hurried behind them as fast as my legs could duck-walk. Spoiler alert, it wasn't that fast, duck-walking was hard, and then peered through the leaves to the path ahead. Just around the corner from where I'd been walking, seriously, I would have walked directly into this mess if I'd continued for another minute and turned one corner, was a monster I'd never seen, and it seemed to be targeting two unfortunate people, by singing. Here's where I'll describe the Sandra, and bear with me. They're weird. Not like the other monsters aren't, but, well, please remember that these fuckers creep me out. And that's saying something, considering all that I've seen. The Sandra was humanoid-shaped, and about the size of a human too, but all over its body, growing out of its skin, or maybe instead of its skin, it was hard to tell, were plants and fungi. Little leaves, mushrooms, flowers, you name it, it was growing there. It also appeared to have thin vines wrapped around its arms and legs, only the vines weren't just wrapped, they grew from its body. I could see where they emerged from its skin at its shoulders and hips. Now, from my spot in the bush, I had a side view of the monster, and it looked like where its ears should be were mushrooms instead. I couldn't see its face, but I was sure it couldn't be better than the rest of it. The more I stared at the mushroom ears and the open skin holes from which the vines emerged, the more I wanted to vomit. If you don't think it sounds gross, good for you, but I assure you it was. Sidebar. In case you were wondering, their name's Sandra is after a girl in my biology class. She was also one of the stars of the school chorus, and she sang all the fucking time. Like she got permission from the teacher to write and perform her own song instead of doing a PowerPoint when we had to do presentations on genetics. It was awful. Don't get me wrong, her voice was great, but the song was the worst thing I've heard in my entire life. She should stick to the singing part and leave the songwriting part to someone else. Well, I guess she can't now, because she's dead. But trust me, it was horrible. And she was obnoxious the rest of the time, too. One of those people who always manages to bring up their accomplishments in every single conversation they ever have. For her, it was her music accomplishments, and you couldn't talk to her for 2 minutes without her finding a way to bring up her solos. Kill me. Anyway, biology and chorus covers both the plants and the singing. Seemed like a perfect fit. To be fair to Sandra, I will clarify that she wasn't nearly as bad as Caleb. Caleb was in the biology class too, and I had to do that same presentation on genetics with him. He did none of the PowerPoint except adding one single piece of clip art on a Punnett square, and then he brought in his 23andMe test results the day of the presentation and talked about that instead of his slides. This was our final project for the class. We did not get a good grade. Fuck Caleb. Sidebar over. While Sandra was singing and I was watching, I also had my hands over my ears the entire time, and my arms were starting to hurt. Plus, I could still hear the singing, and my head was still throbbing. I was racking my aching brain for solutions while watching this unfold. And unfold it did. Holy shit, did it. I had no idea what to expect, but whatever I considered, it sure as hell wasn't what went down. Of the two people, the closer one to the monster was a man, and the one slightly further back, perhaps 10 steps behind her partner, was a woman. They both looked to be older than me, but not that much older. I don't know, I'm not good at judging ages, leave me alone. They both had their hands over their ears, like me, so I guess they'd been caught unprepared too. And the monster was just standing singing. So far I hadn't seen it make any move. That is, until the man suddenly screamed in frustration, loud enough for me to hear even through my hands and to make me wince, and ripped his hands from his ears, reaching for a gun at his feet. It was a quick movement, but the monster was quicker. As soon as his hands had left his ears, the Sandra had raised up its arms, as if giving itself a crescendo, and increased both the volume and the tempo of its singing. God, was it horrific! A spike of pain shot through my head, and my ears filled with pressure, not unlike the feeling of an ear infection. I had one once when I was little, and it's the most similar thing I can describe to you, although even that's not exactly right. The pain from the singing was worse. And that was it for the man. He'd grabbed the gun and raised it to fire. I think he even got a shot off, because I heard a gunshot through the singing, but he'd had to close his eyes against the pain, and the shot went nowhere near the monster. Keep in mind that this man was literally 10 feet from the Sandra and had nothing covering his ears. And then imagine what pain he must have been in, considering the significant pain I was in, with my ears covered and further away. Poor sucker never stood a chance. Sure enough, he never got the chance to fire another shot, because his head exploded. Yes, I'm serious. It just fucking blew apart, and blood splashed everywhere. Some even reached the leaves of my hiding bushes, and I gagged a little at the smell. And then I watched as his headless body stumbled and fell to the ground. Through all this, the singing never stopped, though it did return to its original volume and tempo once his head exploded. And then the Sandra turned to the woman and took a few steps forward. I wish I could have helped. Please don't think I was heartless, but what the hell could I do? I'd just seen a guy have his head turned into a bomb when he'd taken his hands off his ears for like 10 seconds. And I wasn't about to run out there when I had my ears instead of a weapon in my hands. I'm a nice person, but I'm not about to get myself killed for no reason to save someone I've never met against a monster I don't know how to fight. That would be idiotic, even for me. I do still feel bad, though, especially after what happened to the woman. She tried to run. I guess seeing that her friend's tactic of choosing a weapon over blocking out the noise didn't work, she figured her best option was to flee. And honestly, I don't blame her. I would have done the same. That's why I say that if it had been after me, I'd be dead. Because she very quickly was. Dead, I mean. She turned and tried to run, her hands still on her ears. She made it only a few steps before the vines on the Sandra's arms unraveled and flew after her. They grew thicker and longer as they left its arms, and they just kept coming, stretching the entire distance between the monster and the woman with impressive speed. Where the hell had all that length of vine come from? Was there just a coil of vines where its organs should be? I don't like to think about it. In seconds, one had wrapped around her ankles, bringing her crashing to the ground. The other wrapped around her abdomen, preventing her from thrashing too much. And they pulled her closer to the Sandra. She was crying now and trying to struggle, but the vines had become as thick as a tree trunk, and her movements did nothing. When she'd been dragged right to the Sandra's feet, I expected it to remove her hands and sing until her head exploded. But it didn't. Maybe it was pissed that she tried to run and thought she deserved to suffer even more. It plucked a mushroom from its body, crouched down, and shoved it into her mouth. She couldn't stop it without moving her hands. There was no way to win. And I watched as mushrooms immediately sprouted up all over her body, bursting through her skin with little sprays of blood. She screamed until mushrooms took over her head too. Then, once all I could see were bloody mushrooms, her body simply dissolved into dust, leaving only a pile of mushrooms behind. Once she was gone, the Sandra finally stopped singing. I breathed a sigh of relief and removed my hands, bringing them down to see the palms slick with blood. Then Mr. B chirped in alarm, and I looked up to see that my sigh had apparently been audible, because the Sandra was staring towards the bush. I again fought the urge to vomit, because I could now see its face. Little purple flowers filled in its eye sockets, and its mouth was simply a gaping black hole. Fuck, I cursed softly. We made eye contact briefly. Well, as much as you could call it eye contact between my eyes and the flowers. Through the bush, and in that instant we both knew what was about to happen. As it resumed its singing, I ripped off my shirt and tied it around my head as quickly as I could, which it turns out is super quick when my life is in danger. A shirt is an ideal ear cover, but I tied it tightly around my ears, and honestly, it wasn't any worse than using my hands. Yes, my head exploded with pain even during the few seconds it took, but I was fast enough and far enough away that my head didn't literally explode. And yes, if you see where this is going, you're right. I took on the Sandra while shirtless. I knew I couldn't run, because I'd just seen what happened if I tried that. Luckily, I'd already encountered Brents by then, so I was always carrying a lighter and at least one makeshift explosive. My knife or pistol didn't seem like much help. Setting it on fire seemed like the best option. I slowly reached into my duffel and put out the Molotov cocktail, and then with my other hand grabbed my lighter from the pocket of my jeans. Cautiously, I stood up from behind the bush, Mr. B at my ankles. The Sandra had come closer, and the singing was getting more excruciating, even through my shirt head wrap. I saw it raise its arms in its crescendo, its voice picking up the pace and volume. My head began to throb, each note sending a new wave of pain through my skull. The shirt was soaked with blood. I could barely keep my eyes open, and I knew I had to do it now, or it would be too late. Blinking back tears of pain, I fumbled and managed to light the cocktail, and then I threw. Thank God I've got a pretty good arm from playing high school basketball, because, even struggling to see, I hit the Sandra dead on, and it went up in flames. I watched as all its plants burnt and died. As it collapsed, screaming, I had no sympathy, as its body, like the poor woman's, dissolved into dust, leaving a mound of ash and smoking remnants of vines. Then I went home, because that was enough excitement for one day, and even the weather didn't seem so appealing after that. I still have nightmares about that encounter, occasionally. The Sanders are the main reason I don't want to risk hardware stores. I've seen them congregate in the garden sections there. I carry earplugs all the time now, obviously, but if I had to face multiple Sanders at once, I think their combined singing would overwhelm my ears, and probably explode my head anyway, earplugs or not. And I don't know about you guys, but I really like my head the way it is. You know, in one piece. Also, Sanders creep me the fuck out, so avoiding them is fine with me.